Turning your Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 4. So from Elijah to Elisha, and there's a good story about as Elijah is preparing to be received by God, and Elisha's following him. And Elisha has told Elijah, I'm going to get those two mixed up in a moment, okay, at some point. I'll go wherever you go, Master. He understands that Elijah's his mentor and ultimately becomes his friend, because they go through the last part of Elijah's ministry together. But as time is coming, he's called to, Elijah's like, you stay here. He goes, nope. Whatever happens to you and however this ends, I'm going to be with you. And other people come and say, he says, no, I told him a long time ago. And he walks with him until Elijah is received by God and taken up. And Elisha is there. And so it's interesting when you'll see and understand out of the stories today, out of this chapter, literally you're going to hear some of the stories we talked about in the very beginning as we started to do these two prophets. And we are doing communion, so I'm not going to try to especially read the last half of this chapter, most likely. But when I started to think about it, I hear Elijah, but then I'm going to try to point out to you that we see somebody else in these stories as well. We move over to a New Testament piece. I don't know about y'all, but I feel much comfortable that I don't have to be standing just right over here. Okay? Did anybody who was here last week feel that? So, but it's undeniable to not see Elijah in this story. But I think it's also undeniable to see that the one who comes, the one who is promised, the one who will celebrate toward the end of our service today, is tied to these same pieces and these same stories that we hear out of Elisha. That's going to be challenging. I got to have these to read. 2 Kings chapter 4, starting with verse 1. It says, the wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know that he revered the Lord, but now his creditor is coming to take my two boys as his slaves. And Elisha replied to her, how can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house? Your servant has nothing there at all, she said, except a small jar of olive oil. And so we don't understand, and we don't live in the context of what is happening right here. But we don't live in a world where if I can't pay my debts, that indentured servitude or slavery comes, indebtedness. If I owe a debt, they could claim me, or they could claim my children. And in this case, the two most profitable things they could have done was to claim this lady's two children. Elisha responds out of the way that you can, out of order. He goes, okay, what are we missing? Is there something in the house that we can sell to keep this from happening? He responds out of logic and sense, which we all have. God has given us, and that's how he responds out of that. And she says, there's nothing there. And so now we're back, and here's the spot where I can't help but think of Elijah. Where is it when the second miracle that comes about, where is it when he finds himself in front of the widow? The widow says, how in the world am I going to feed you? I'm about to go make the last little piece of bread and with the oil that I have and prepare to die with my son. We saw a miracle that the oil never ran out. There's a different piece for this as Elisha is starting to do a miracle with oil. There's a little bit of a test of her faith as well. It's about what he asked her to do. Elisha said, go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you, you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put one aside. So she left him, and she shut the door behind her and her sons. There you go. They brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. When all the jars were full, she said to her sons, bring me another one. And they replied, but there's no jar left. And then the oil stopped flowing. It's interesting to me in the midst of it when Elisha challenges the widow to go get jars. He goes, don't go get a few. There's something coming. He insinuates there's something coming for you. But this is about how much faith do you have? Like going to my sister-in-law's to get mason jars wouldn't have been isn't real profitable. You get a few mason jars over there. But now if you come to the Elmore's house, there's mason jars. How many are you willing to ask for? How many are you willing to haul away? Because it takes a bunch. They're under the bed and they're out in the building and they're stored all around the kitchen. Some of them have a lot in them and some are empty. Okay? But he says, how much faith do you have? Go collect all the jars you can. Then let's see not only where you are, but where God is. And for every empty jar that they asked for up and down the street, God provided oil. It's interesting in verse 7, he says, now, by the way, he says, go and sell some of the oil. There's plenty there. And you'll be able to pay off these creditors. And then he says, by the way, there's going to be plenty of jars left over. And he wants to say, if you had enough faith, because remember, the tap was open as long as there was empty jars. As long as you had enough faith. He doesn't say that, but you can read between the lines. There's enough now that you can live on. Because remember, as a widow, she's second-class citizens at best. Her children are the ones who will take care of her later. She's got to get them to a spot where they can. She's at the end of the road. And it's hard for us to understand and exactly grasp that because we don't function that way. Hallelujah. But he says, I want you to step into that. And all of a sudden, God provides. And by the way, this is somebody out of the family of faith. This is somebody who's been in service to the prophets, to those. So it's those already in the circle God provides for. And so when God starts to provide us, and yet we live with debt in our lives. And I'm not just talking about the financial debt, but we live with a debt of sin. And because we move from debt, and our sin debt leads us to a slavery of the flesh. That we are bound to it. And Paul tells us, he goes, one of the hardest things to happen if we don't have Jesus in our life is to living into the cries of the flesh. And that sin debt is, we live in it. It's the closest thing to where she was. Her indebtedness was going to lead to slavery. And yet you and I live in a very similar spot. Elisha's act of mercy provides new life. He provides a way. And yet, when Jesus comes, he provides some of that answer, or he provides the answer, sorry. That's bad theology. Some of the answer. Jesus provides the one answer for our sin debt through his grace. Have any of you ever known anybody going through bankruptcy or headed into bankruptcy? I have. I've known several people in it. And Kay and I struggled with part of it where, I hate to say it, we had to give a house back to somebody, back to the bank. It's the only bill we haven't ever paid in our life. It was daunting. But I think about my friend who faced bankruptcy. And for them, that's the closest example I could think of in modern day to this. Yeah, but I'm worried about the folks on Facebook more so than I know I can talk loud enough for in here. What I remember is that my friend, every day and every moment, he thought about it. Now, he realized that he and his wife had made some bad decisions along the way. They didn't end up there just by happenstance or just by cruising through life. They had made some bad decisions. But the reality was it became this thing that weighed on them everywhere they went and with everything they did. Their kids were the same age as ours, so going out to eat all of a sudden became a problem. When the car broke down, it became a problem. It was always there. It was a weight that was heavier than a lot of things I had seen. In some ways, it was heavier than seeing a loss of death, because when we expect to experience death in our life, we expect to experience those types of loss and things, right? And other people see it and have it, and it happens around us. And this is one of those things that nobody wants to talk about. And so we don't know how to handle it. And it lasts for years. Even after they went through it, then there's this 8+ years of it being on your record, and God, and on it goes. That's where this lady was. She had this thing around her that she couldn't understand. And Elisha comes in and offers the mercy of God and says, "Let me help." And very much Jesus comes when we're at our lowest point, and when we realize that we are at a place where we can't pay it off. Because that's the one thing that it tells us in the scriptures, is that you and I have a debt we can't pay. Nobody's righteous. Nobody's good enough. Nobody gives enough. It said the only thing that was perfect, the only sacrifice that was enough for my sin and for yours, was Jesus. And the grace and the mercy of life, of somebody carrying that, brings new life. I want to do just these next few verses, 8 through 17. And what we see is we see somebody outside of the Israel family, somebody outside of the family of belief. Okay? And so it says, and one day Elisha went to Shunem, and a well-to-do woman was there, and she urged him to stay for a meal. So whenever he came by, and he stopped there to eat, she said to her husband, "I know that this man who often comes our way is a holy man of God. Let's make a small room on the roof and put a bed and a table and a chair and a lamp for him, so he can stay there whenever he comes to us." And one day when Elisha came, he went up to his room and he laid down there, and he said to his servant Gehazi, "Call to the Shunammite woman." So he called her, and she stood before him, and Elisha says, you have gone to all this trouble for us. Now what can be done for you? Can we speak on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army? And she replied, I have a home among my people. What can be done for her? Elisha asked. Jesus says, she has no son and her husband is old. All of a sudden I hear Abraham and Sarah. I hear so often you start to hear these stories of those who couldn't have children, and all of a sudden Elisha's going to promise that when he returns in a year, she'll be holding a child. And she says to him, she goes, don't make that promise to me. Don't even go there. We have lived this fight. We have lived this turmoil for so long. She has a child. She has a son. Just as Elisha would say. The interesting part is when you read all the way down to 37, much like the widow and the son that Elijah encountered, the son dies, and she literally doesn't tell her husband. She goes and gets Elisha, brings him back, and won't tell the husband, who is old and will die before her, which would put her where? In the same spot that the widow we just saw a few moments ago. Okay? With no family. She's now facing slavery again. But I couldn't help but remember when Jairus' daughter dies and Jesus comes to heal her. Because see, when the grace and mercy of Christ comes, is offered in this case by the prophet, through him new life comes. Elisha's work resembles so much the work of Jesus, because it did not matter who he encountered. He extended grace and mercy. He says, how can I help you? So often somebody came to Jesus and they said, "Ed, I'm blind, I'm lame, I have leprosy," and on it goes. And if you think about the miracle stories with Jesus, where do they start? More often than not, he takes care of their faith, and then he does the miracle that is physical. He extends grace and mercy to their spiritual soul. If you start going back and reading as you prepare to walk through Lent, it'd be an interesting way for you to walk through Lent. Start reading the miracles of Jesus. And more often than not, what you will see is that you'll see that Jesus, I'm trying to think of one where he does it backwards. It's almost always, and I'm saying almost because I'm doing this off the top of my head, theology. He's almost always deals with their faith and then the physical miracle. And you and I go, well, we don't have that ability. John, I can't make somebody whole again. Well, the reality is we can extend grace and mercy in lots of ways to those both inside and outside of the family of God. I challenged and encouraged you when we were saying to Mick and to Kirk, you're part of our family now. You're part of this body. Y'all done a good job of treating them that way beforehand, but we said it officially today. But the reality is, when we start doing these little things, it makes a difference. It was funny, we got a thank you note this week from somebody because they got a birthday card from our group and if you haven't had your birthday recently, you're going to get a birthday card from church. And there's some folks who are doing that, and that person was so thankful that they got a simple birthday card. The other thing, I got a text from Irvin McCurry, and he was going, "John, I'm not sure we need the ramp, but I can't tell you how much it made our life easier." And see, when we do little bitty things, whether it's a Meals on Wheels, or whether it is to help somebody with a medical bill, or to help somebody along the way. So when all of a sudden you extend grace and mercy, you extend the hand of God so that others might see that Jesus. Elisha finds himself obedient to understanding the call. God knows the needs around us, and He'll provide for them as they surface. Our task is to be open, available, and obedient. That is how it leads us to be the hands of grace and mercy that Christ might use. That somebody might then experience the grace of what it means to come to Jesus. I wonder sometimes, are we open? I know this is one of those things that I had to learn to pray. I didn't learn to pray to ask God to open my eyes, to make me available and to see when I should share my faith until I was in seminary. And it was later in seminary. It wasn't when I first got there. It's one of my mentors who taught me that, Calvin Pearson. And it changes all of a sudden when I start to ask God to, Lord, will you open my mind and my heart to the people I encounter today, that I might see how I can tell them a Jesus story and how I can be your hands and feet. Elisha, every time he was encountered, we see him in this whole chapter. He is open. He's asked God to let me be your hands of mercy and grace. Because then out of that side, then they get to see Jesus, the one who offers the ultimate grace from death to life. Man, are you open and available to being the mercy and the grace of Jesus Christ to the people you encounter, that they might see Jesus? Whether they're in our family or not. That's the challenge that we face. And I think sometimes it's hard because we'll love our own. I'm not sure we're going to love somebody else. Those are the challenges. But you know what? Where was it that Jesus was? When he invited all of his own to the wedding feast, the parable of the wedding feast. And so they're like, hey, they all didn't come. He goes, highways, hedges, ditches, wherever you can find them, bring them so that they may know my grace and my love. So that's your sermon for today.